February 11, 1945, Livadia Palace, Yalta. The final communique from the conference had been signed hours earlier, and the three Allied leaders were preparing to depart. Franklin Roosevelt expressed cautious optimism about the agreements they had reached. Winston Churchill voiced hope that wartime cooperation might survive into the peace, and Joseph Stalin offered repeated assurances about free elections in liberated Eastern Europe. According to later accounts, however, when Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov quietly raised concerns that the wording of the Yalta Agreement might complicate Soviet plans in the region, Stalin's reply suggested he saw those promises less as binding commitments and more as temporary diplomatic tools. Never mind, we'll do it our own way later. With those words, Joseph Stalin privately dismissed the promises he had just made to the West. Now, whether this exchange happened exactly as reported is impossible to confirm with absolute certainty, but the months that followed strongly indicate that Stalin never intended to fully honor the political commitments made at Yalta. While Western leaders left Crimea believing they had secured democratic futures for Poland, Hungary, and other Eastern European countries, Soviet forces and security services were already putting in place what looked like a systematic program for Soviet domination. That program would reshape the lives of more than 100 million people and establish communist regimes that lasted for nearly half a century. The Yalta Conference brought together the three most powerful wartime leaders at a moment when Germany's defeat was no longer in doubt, but the political map of post-war Europe remained unsettled and fragile. Soviet troops stood close to Berlin after pushing German forces back across Eastern Europe at enormous human and material cost. American and British forces were advancing from the west, having broken through after the Battle of the Bulge and now driving into the German heartland. Between them, Germany was being squeezed from both directions, and everyone in Yalta understood that the war in Europe would end within a matter of months rather than years. The central question was what would follow German surrender. Across Eastern Europe, nations that had endured years of Nazi occupation now found themselves under the control of Soviet armies. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia all faced an uncertain future. Would they regain genuine independence and choose their own governments? Or would decisions about their political systems be made elsewhere? Would they become democracies in practice, or would they fall under Soviet control behind a new line of division? The answers would determine not only the fate of those countries, but also the structure of the entire post-war international order. The Yalta meeting was the last time Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin sat together as wartime allies to decide Europe's future. With victory imminent, they tried to define the post-war settlement, especially for territories liberated by the Red Army. Each leader arrived at the conference with priorities rooted in national interests, domestic pressures, and the emotional weight of years of war. Roosevelt focused on two core objectives. He wanted Soviet entry into the war against Japan, where American planners expected a costly campaign and feared that an invasion of the home islands could result in enormous American casualties. He also wanted the Soviet Union to participate fully in the new United Nations organization, which he saw as essential to preventing another global conflict. Churchill, by contrast, concentrated on the political future of Europe, pressing for genuinely free elections and democratic governments in Eastern Europe, with particular emphasis on Poland, whose independence Britain had pledged to defend in 1939. After 6 years of war, Churchill wanted the peace to reflect the principles for which Britain claimed to have fought, not simply a new division of the continent under a different occupying power. Stalin's goals differed fundamentally from those of his partners. He wanted a broad Soviet sphere of influence across Eastern Europe that would act as a permanent buffer against any future invasion from the West. Russia had been invaded through Eastern Europe twice in less than 30 years, first during World War I and again by Nazi Germany in 1941. The second invasion had been catastrophic, costing the Soviet Union tens of millions of lives and leaving much of Western Russia in ruins. Stalin intended to prevent any repetition of that experience, and he believed the only reliable safeguard was direct or indirect control over the states along the Soviet Union's western frontier. To that end, he demanded major territorial adjustments. Poland would lose its eastern territories to the Soviet Union, but receive former German lands in the west as compensation, shifting the Soviet border further from Moscow and Leningrad, while permanently weakening Germany's position in Central Europe. These changes were not only about correcting old borders, but about building strategic depth and ensuring that any potential invader would have to cross a chain of states aligned with Moscow before reaching Soviet soil. On paper, The final Yalta agreements seemed to reconcile these competing interests. Stalin pledged that liberated countries would be allowed to hold free elections and form governments that were broadly representative of all democratic elements. The language promised governments responsive to the will of the people, and Roosevelt and Churchill took these assurances at face value. Both believed that Stalin's explicit commitments in a signed agreement carried real weight. Neither fully grasped how far the Soviet interpretation of democracy and representation diverged from theirs, or how willing Stalin was to treat diplomatic promises as expendable once they no longer served his purposes. The gap between words and reality appeared first and most clearly in Poland. As the Red Army moved across Polish territory in 1944, Soviet security forces followed, targeting the Polish Home Army, a resistance movement loyal to the London-based government in exile rather than to Moscow. The Home Army was one of the largest underground movements in occupied Europe. At its peak, hundreds of thousands of members had carried out sabotage, gathered intelligence, and maintained clandestine administration during German occupation. Many had also taken part in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, a desperate effort to liberate the capital before Soviet troops arrived. The uprising ended in catastrophic defeat after weeks of fighting, with German forces destroying large parts of the city and killing huge numbers of civilians. When Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw in early 1945, surviving members of the Home Army expected recognition as allies who had resisted the Germans from within. Instead, they were treated as potential enemies. From Stalin's perspective, they posed a political threat because their legitimacy came from a non-communist government abroad, and their commitment to an independent, pluralist Poland clashed with his plans for a tightly controlled satellite state. The scale of repression was extensive. Underground fighters and civilian supporters were arrested, interrogated, and deported to labor camps deep inside the Soviet Union. Many never returned. These were not figures associated with fascism or collaboration, but individuals who had risked their lives in the name of Polish independence. A dramatic example of this strategy came when senior leaders of the Polish resistance were invited for talks and then seized, transported to Moscow, and put on trial. Their removal effectively shattered what remained of a coordinated national leadership that might have resisted Soviet plans. With opposition weakened, Stalin backed the installation of a provisional government led by Bolesław Bierut, a Polish communist who'd spent years in the Soviet Union. Completely loyal to Moscow, Bierut worked closely with Soviet advisors and security officers to neutralize political rivals and consolidate control. When Poland finally held elections in 1947, it did so only after a prolonged period during which opposition parties had been infiltrated, harassed, and stripped of influence. Western pressure had forced the Soviets to accept the appearance of a multi-party process, but communist authorities understood they lacked genuine popular support and that a fair vote could easily defeat them. Instead, they manipulated the process at every stage. Opposition candidates were harassed and sometimes detained, local organizations were infiltrated, ballot boxes were tampered with, and vote counts were altered. Reports from the time, including some from Soviet officials, indicated that the published results significantly overstated communist support. Nonetheless, the official figures claimed an overwhelming communist victory. Within a short time, Poland had been transformed into a one-party state aligned with Moscow, and it would remain so for decades. Hungary's experience followed a somewhat different course that highlighted Stalin's tactical flexibility and his willingness to adapt methods to circumstances. Instead of immediate and overt repression on the Polish model, he endorsed a gradual approach that made use of coalition politics and legal procedures. The objective remained the same: complete communist control, but the path toward that outcome was designed to look less abrupt and therefore less likely to trigger strong Western reactions, while memories of Yalta were still fresh. Matyas Rákosi, a committed communist who had spent years in prison and exile, returned to Hungary with the Red Army in 1945. Stalin instructed him to participate in a coalition government and to avoid a premature confrontation with other parties. Hungary's first post-war elections were widely regarded as free and competitive. The Smallholders Party, which drew support from farmers and middle-class voters, won a convincing majority, while the Communist Party finished far behind. In a normal democratic system, that result would have translated into stable majority rule and a limited role for the communists. Hungary, however, was not operating under normal conditions. Soviet troops remained in the country, and communist leaders insisted on controlling key ministries, especially the Interior Ministry, which supervised the police and emerging security apparatus. From these positions, Rákosi and his allies began to undermine rival parties, framing opponents as reactionaries or potential fascist sympathizers, and using state power to harass, intimidate, or arrest them. Rákosi described his method as Salami tactics, removing opponents slice by slice until almost nothing remained. Right-wing figures were targeted first, followed by centrists, and then moderates on the left. Each step could be justified to outside observers as a necessary response to alleged extremism or anti-democratic behavior, but taken together, the process dismantled the entire democratic spectrum. By the late 1940s, the main opposition parties had been broken apart. Some leaders were jailed, others fled abroad, and several organizations were forced to merge with the communists under intense pressure. Without a dramatic coup or obvious single turning point, Hungary moved from pluralism to one-party rule in just a few years. Poland and Hungary illustrated two different routes to the same destination. In one case, direct repression destroyed resistance quickly. In the other, a slow, legally framed strategy hollowed out independent politics. Elsewhere in Eastern Europe, variations of these approaches appeared. Romania saw the formation of a communist-led government under Soviet supervision in 1945. Bulgaria followed a similar pattern, with initial coalitions giving way to tighter control. Czechoslovakia initially seemed more autonomous, retaining a measure of political diversity, but by 1948, communist leaders, supported by Soviet influence and local security forces, orchestrated a political crisis that allowed them to seize full control and eliminate rivals. At the same time, Stalin extended Soviet reach through outright annexation in certain territories. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been occupied and incorporated into the Soviet Union in 1940, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. During the German invasion of the Soviet Union, many people in these countries initially welcomed German troops as potential liberators from Soviet rule, only to experience a new form of occupation. When the Red Army returned in 1944, Soviet authorities restored their earlier annexation and treated it as permanent. The human cost in the Baltic region was severe. Large numbers of people were deported to remote areas of the Soviet Union, often with very little warning, forced to leave their homes with only what they could carry. Those targeted included former government officials, officers, religious leaders, educators, landowners, and others seen as capable of organizing or inspiring resistance. The goal was not simply punishment, but the removal of social and political structures that might support an alternative national identity. Similar processes unfolded in other annexed areas. Eastern Polish territories were integrated into the Soviet Union, accompanied by population movements that relocated Poles westward and moved other groups, such as Ukrainians and Belarusians, into areas now incorporated into Soviet republics. Parts of Finland and Romania were likewise seized, extending Soviet borders and altering the demographic map. In total, the Soviet Union gained significant new territory and millions of additional citizens as a result of these annexations and population transfers. As these political and territorial changes unfolded, governments in the emerging people's democracies were reshaped along Soviet lines, not only in composition, but also in function. Industries were nationalized, reducing or eliminating private ownership in key sectors of the economy. Agriculture was pushed toward collectivization, although the pace and intensity varied from country to country. Secret police organizations modeled on Soviet institutions took root in each state, monitoring citizens, investigating suspected opposition, and carrying out arrests and interrogations. Religious institutions and universities, important sources of independent influence, came under strict control. In heavily Catholic countries such as Poland and Hungary, pressure on the church was particularly intense, with clergy facing surveillance, detention, and public campaigns aimed at undermining their authority. By March 1946, the general direction of Soviet policy in Eastern Europe had become clear enough that Churchill, now out of office but still influential, described the new situation in unusually stark terms. In a speech in Fulton, Missouri, he spoke of an iron curtain descending across the continent, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic and separating Soviet-controlled areas from the West. His phrase captured a reality that many diplomats and observers in Europe already recognized. The hopes raised by Yalta's language about free elections and representative governments had not been realized, and a new division of Europe had emerged. Churchill's assessment reflected a broader shift in Western thinking. Reports from diplomats, journalists, missionaries, and refugees described election manipulation, censorship, political arrests, and the steady consolidation of communist power. Although public statements from Soviet officials still referred to democracy and reconstruction, the actual practices in Eastern Europe told a different story. Stalin's reported remark to foreign communist leaders that each system would extend its influence as far as its armies had advanced summarized the underlying logic of Soviet behavior more accurately than any formal communiqué. For many people in Eastern Europe, Yalta became a symbol of disappointment and abandonment. They had endured Nazi occupation with the expectation that liberation would bring self-government and renewed independence. Instead, one form of foreign dominance gave way to another, more subtle but equally pervasive. The Truman administration initially tried to use diplomatic channels to press for fulfillment of the Yalta promises, but as the reality of Soviet control hardened, American policy shifted toward containing further expansion rather than attempting to roll back what had already been established. The system created in these years endured until the end of the 1980s. Communist parties remained in power, borders stayed largely unchanged, and alliance structures developed after the war reinforced the division of Europe. Although leadership and policies evolved within the Soviet bloc, the basic framework Stalin had imposed remained remarkably durable. The human cost of this system was immense. Many people were imprisoned, deported, or executed during purges, show trials, and security campaigns. Many more spent their entire lives under regimes that restricted basic freedoms and required constant accommodation to official ideology. Political opposition, independent journalism, and open religious practice were limited or suppressed. Families were separated by border changes, deportations, and emigration, and public life was shaped by propaganda designed to present the system as historical necessity. The methods used across Eastern Europe, military occupation, political manipulation, economic extraction, and cultural control, varied in local details, but followed a recognizable pattern that pointed to central direction from Moscow. Whether every step had been planned in detail at Yalta, or whether the system evolved through a series of tactical decisions, the result was the same. A region of states whose internal and external policies were tightly aligned with Soviet interests. Western governments had access to information about these developments almost as soon as they occurred, but their options for response were constrained by war weariness, demobilization, and the fear of renewed conflict. The choice was not between immediate intervention and complacency, but between accepting a painful reality or risking another major war. In that context, containment seemed the least dangerous option, even though it meant that many Eastern European nations would remain under Soviet influence for decades. The experience of Yalta and its aftermath shaped Western attitudes toward the Soviet Union for the rest of the Cold War. Policymakers became deeply skeptical of Soviet assurances, knowing from experience that formal commitments could be set aside whenever they conflicted with strategic needs. Future negotiations and treaties were approached with caution, and the memory of what had happened in Eastern Europe remained a constant reference point in debates about trust and verification. In Eastern Europe itself, memories of pre-war independence and of the early post-war struggle never fully disappeared. Even under tight control, people continued to pass down stories of earlier freedoms, preserved local traditions, and maintained religious practices where possible. When communist rule finally began to weaken in the late 1980s, the speed and breadth of change revealed that the system had never rested on genuine consent. The millions who suffered arrests, deportations, and political repression were at the center of this history. Their experiences highlighted the distance between the hopeful language of liberation and the reality of a new hierarchy enforced by security services and foreign-backed governments. The promises made at Yalta did not survive contact with Stalin's broader strategic objectives. Within a few years, Eastern Europe had been transformed into a set of states whose political and economic systems were shaped to serve Soviet security and ideological goals. That transformation divided Europe for nearly 50 years and continues to influence how nations in the region think about sovereignty, security, and the value of binding international commitments today.